I never imagined my last breath would be stolen by the very people who gave me life. The pain was distant now. Numbness had taken over, my body surrendering to the slow poison that ran through my veins. The room blurred, voices distorted, but I could still hear them. My mother. My father. My murderers. She's finally quiet, my mother muttered, a sigh of relief in her voice. My father's footsteps echoed as he walked closer. It had to be done. She was never meant to survive. I tried to move, to scream, but my body wouldn't obey. I was dying, and they didn't even care. My sister, their golden child, sat across the room untouched, unbothered. She wasn't the one suffering. She was the one they chose to protect. She would have ruined everything, my father continued, his voice cold. Her existence was always a mistake. I could feel my pulse weakening, fading. All my life I had fought to earn their love, their approval. But now, as my body shut down, I realized the truth. I was never their child. I was an obstacle, a problem they had finally erased. And just before the darkness swallowed me whole, I made a vow. If I ever got another chance, I wouldn't beg for their love. I would make them suffer. I woke up with a gasp. Cold air rushed into my lungs, my body jerking upright. My heart pounded in my chest. A rhythm I wasn't supposed to feel anymore. I was supposed to be dead. But I wasn't. I looked around, my breath hitching. This room. This was my childhood bedroom. I scrambled out of bed, hands trembling as I ran to the mirror. The reflection staring back at me wasn't the frail, dying girl from my last moments. It was me. Younger. Alive. This wasn't a dream. I had been reborn. I pressed a hand against my racing heart. The memories flooded in, overwhelming and suffocating. The poison. The betrayal. The way they had watched me die without a single trace of remorse. They had planned it from the start. And now I was back. Before the betrayal. Before my death. This time I wouldn't wait for them to strike first. This time I was the one holding the knife. Downstairs I could hear them. The voices of my murderers. Laughing. Talking. Acting as if they weren't destined to kill me in the future. I clenched my fists. I had spent my last life believing they loved me. Blindly trusting them until the very end. Never again. I wouldn't beg for their love. I wouldn't cry for their approval. I would smile in their faces while planning their downfall. Because they thought they were the ones in control. They had no idea their victim had returned. I forced my hands to stay still, my expression blank as I sat at the breakfast table. The same table where my family, my murderers, ate every morning pretending to be perfect. Everything was exactly as I remembered. My mother, dressed elegantly as always, buttering her toast while pretending to be a loving mother. My father reading the newspaper, the very image of a powerful, respectable man. And my sister, their golden child, their favorite, the one they had chosen over me. I should have been afraid. I should have been overwhelmed by the memories of my death, the betrayal still fresh in my mind. But I wasn't, because they had no idea that I had returned. I looked down at my hands. Steady. Strong. Alive. They had taken everything from me. But this time, I was going to take it all back. My mother's voice broke through my thoughts. "You're quiet today," she said, glancing at me over her coffee cup. "Something on your mind?" My fingers curled around my fork. My lips parted, so many things I wanted to say. "You killed me. I heard you. I heard every word. You chose her. You let me die." Instead I smiled. "Just thinking," I said softly. She returned my smile, but I saw it now. The way she only ever looked at me with polite indifference. Never warmth. Never real love. I had spent my past life pretending I didn't notice. Not this time. My sister let out a small laugh, her tone playful. "That's rare. You usually just go along with whatever mom and dad say." My stomach twisted. She was right. In my past life I had been too trusting, too obedient. Desperately clinging to the hope that if I did everything right, they would finally love me. And where had that gotten me? Dead. Forgotten. Unwanted. I met her gaze, forcing a small laugh of my own. "Maybe I've changed." Her smile faltered just slightly, but I saw it. Good. Let her start wondering. Let them all start wondering. I played along with their conversations, letting them believe I was still the naive daughter they had so easily disposed of before. But my mind was already racing ahead, planning my next move. First, I needed information. I had to find out when they had started planning my death, who had been involved, who else had known. And I needed to make sure they didn't suspect that I knew, which meant I had to be careful, patient. So when my father folded his newspaper and spoke, I didn't miss a beat. "Your next medical checkup is coming up, isn't it?" he asked. "I'll have the driver take you." My blood turned to ice. The checkup, the one where they had started forging my medical reports, where they had decided that my life wasn't worth saving. I took a sip of my tea, hiding the storm raging inside me. "Right," I said lightly. "I almost forgot." Lie. I remembered everything. And this time I wouldn't just let it happen. That afternoon, I went to my father's office while he was out. The door was locked just like before. But I had lived this moment once. I knew where he kept the spare key. Sliding open a small compartment in the bookshelf, I retrieved the key and slipped inside. The scent of leather and ink filled the air, the office exactly as I had remembered, except now it felt smaller. Because now I was no longer afraid. I went straight to the drawer where I knew he kept my medical files. And there it was. The truth. A carefully altered document stating that my condition was untreatable, that no further medical intervention was needed. A lie. And beneath it, my sister's file. I scanned the papers quickly, my heartbeat hammering as I read the truth that had been hidden from me for so long. They had taken my treatment and given it to her. They had chosen her life over mine. I swallowed down the bitter rage bubbling inside me. Now I had proof. But exposing them outright wasn't enough. No, I wanted them to suffer. I wanted them to feel the same helplessness I had felt as they watched their world fall apart. And to do that, I had to make them think they were still in control. I put the files back exactly as they were, locking the drawer behind me. Then I walked downstairs, smiling as I joined my mother for tea. As if I hadn't just uncovered the biggest betrayal of my life. As if I hadn't just made my first move. As if I wasn't about to destroy them all from the inside. I sat across from my mother, sipping tea as if I hadn't just uncovered the proof of their betrayal. She smiled at me, her expression calm, controlled, fake. I used to believe that smile. I used to think it meant love. Now I knew the truth. She was a liar. A murderer. And she had no idea that her victim had come back to haunt her. I forced a small, innocent smile. "Mom, do you think I've been acting different lately?" Her hand paused slightly before she set down her teacup. She noticed. She was already watching me. Good. Let her. I was watching her too. I spent the next few days playing the fool. Smiling. Laughing. Pretending to be the obedient child they had expected to die. But behind the scenes I was already pulling the strings. I needed to make them doubt each other. I needed to make them paranoid. And the best way to do that? Start feeding them small lies. I began with my father. One evening while he worked in his office, I knocked on the door. He looked up slightly surprised. I never used to visit him. Perfect. I walked inside, keeping my voice casual. "Dad, I overheard something strange today." He raised a brow. "What was it?" I hesitated just for effect. Then I whispered. "Mom was talking about moving some money into a private account." His expression darkened immediately. I knew my parents trusted each other, but only to a point. They had secrets from each other. And now I was going to make them doubt everything. Next, I went to my mother. I sat with her in the garden, watching her trim flowers like she hadn't just orchestrated my death in my past life. I leaned in slightly. "Mom, is something wrong with Dad?" She blinked, her expression carefully neutral. "Why do you ask?" I sighed, feigning worry. "He seems stressed. I think he's hiding something. I don't know, he just looks like he's planning something important." She stilled for a moment. Then she smiled, but her eyes had darkened. She believed me. It didn't take long for the cracks to appear. The next morning at breakfast, my father barely looked at my mother. My mother's gaze was sharp, calculating, like she was already trying to figure out if he was betraying her. I hid my smirk behind my teacup. They had spent my entire life lying to me. Now I was making them lie to each other. But the real test came with my sister. I needed to know if she was innocent. If she had known what was happening all along. So I cornered her in the hallway. "Sis," I said lightly, tilting my head. Do you think Mom and Dad are acting weird lately? She frowned slightly. What do you mean? I sighed. I don't know, I just feel like they're hiding something from me. Her reaction was immediate. Her fingers clenched slightly. Her lips parted as if she wanted to say something, but she stopped herself. And that told me everything I needed to know. She knew. She had always known. That night, I looked at myself in the mirror. My past life self would have cried at this revelation. But not this time. This time I was smiling. Because now, I wasn't just exposing their betrayal. I was controlling it. I sat at the dining table, watching my parents pretend nothing was wrong. But I saw it. The way my father kept glancing at my mother. The slight hesitation before she spoke. The air between them was thick with suspicion. Good. Let them wonder. Let them question each other like I had questioned them my entire past life. But now? I was done playing mind games. It was time to ruin them. The next step of my plan required something bold, public humiliation. Destroying them inside the house wasn't enough. I needed to rip away the respect and admiration they held in society. So I started with their most fragile weakness, their reputation. I carefully leaked the first piece of information to a well-known journalist. My falsified medical records. Not the full truth. Not yet. Just enough to plant a dangerous seed. The article dropped within hours. Respected family accused of withholding treatment from their own child? I could already picture my mother's face draining of color as she read it. I smiled. Let the panic begin. At home, everything fell into absolute chaos. My father stormed into his office making frantic phone calls. My mother paced back and forth trying to get ahead of the rumors. And my sister? She was silent. Because she knew. She knew this wasn't just a rumor. It was the beginning of their downfall. That night, I made sure to leave another piece of evidence where my mother would find it. A hospital document that proved they had switched my medication. A small note was attached. I know what you did. I didn't sign it. I didn't need to. The next morning at breakfast, my mother's hands trembled as she reached for her cup. My father looked even worse, tired, disheveled, on edge. But I wasn't done yet. I set my phone on the table and let a recording play. It was their voices. A conversation they had never expected anyone to hear. My father. She was never meant to survive. We made the right decision. My mother. She wouldn't have had a future anyway. It was better this way. The table went dead silent. My mother dropped her fork. My father's expression turned to pure horror. And my sister? She just stared at me, realization dawning in her eyes. You, she whispered. You knew. I smiled. Slow. Cruel. I've always known. My father was the first to react. His chair scraped against the floor as he stood, his fists clenched, rage simmering beneath his carefully crafted mask. My mother sat frozen, her breathing uneven, her hands gripping the table like she could anchor herself in a storm that had already swallowed her whole. And my sister? She wasn't looking at me anymore. She was looking at them. Because in that moment she realized the truth too. The parents she had trusted, the ones who had favored her, loved her, chosen her, had also lied to her. The recording still played from my phone, their voices echoing through the room. She was never meant to survive. It was better this way. The weight of those words settled into the air, suffocating them, but not me. Because I had already died once. I had already lived through this pain. And now I was free. My father finally spoke, his voice sharp and commanding. Where did you get that recording? I tilted my head, unbothered. Does it matter? His nostrils flared. You think you can destroy us with this? I smiled. I already have. My mother reached for my hand, a pathetic attempt at damage control. Sweetheart, I yanked my hand away before she could touch me. Her face crumbled. You don't understand. I laughed. No, I said coldly. I understand perfectly. Then I turned to my sister. She had been silent for too long. Processing. Thinking. Calculating. She had spent her life believing she was special. The one they had chosen. Now she was realizing she had just been another piece on their chessboard. I watched her swallow hard before she whispered. You knew this whole time? I met her gaze and didn't blink. Yes. Her lips parted, but she had nothing to say. Because what excuse could she make? She had let it happen. She had lived in comfort while I withered away. And now she knew that she was next. The silence was deafening. Then my father snapped. "You ungrateful brat." I turned to him, waiting, watching, enjoying. "You think you can destroy this family? You think anyone will believe you? You have no proof." I slid a USB drive across the table. He froze. My smile widened. "Everything is on here. Every falsified report. Every missing medical record. Every bank transfer." His face lost all color. "Where did you get this?" His voice was shaking now. He was afraid. I leaned forward. "From your office. From the files you thought I'd never find." My mother gasped, turning to him. "You kept records?" He didn't answer. Because he knew. He was already finished. Then he lunged. I was ready. The moment he grabbed my arm, I let out a piercing scream. Within seconds, the house staff came running. And just like that, he had given me exactly what I wanted. They saw it. They saw him grabbing me, screaming at me, losing control. And the moment was captured. A security guard had been recording everything. Within an hour, the police arrived. And the best part? I didn't have to say a single word. Because my father, in his rage, his arrogance, his desperation, had exposed himself. And when they took him away, my mother crumbled. My sister didn't look at me as I walked past her. She had spent her whole life believing she was untouchable. Now she realized she was alone. I paused at the door. Then, just loud enough for her to hear, I said, "Now you know what it feels like." She flinched. I smiled. Then I walked out. And this time, I never looked back. I stood outside the mansion, the place that had once been my home, the same place where I had been discarded, erased, and left to die. Now it was nothing more than a hollow shell. The curtains were drawn. The lights inside dim. My father was gone, arrested. My mother had disappeared from public life, too afraid to show her face. She was nothing without the power and wealth that had shielded her. And my sister? She hadn't spoken to me since the night I walked out. She knew it was over. She knew I had one. But for the first time since my rebirth, I felt something unexpected. Not satisfaction. Not even relief. Emptiness. Because I had spent this entire second life fighting, planning, destroying. And now? There was nothing left to fight. Nothing left to tear apart. I walked through the empty streets, my mind quiet for the first time. I had gotten my revenge. I had destroyed the people who betrayed me. I had rewritten my fate. But now I had to ask myself, what kind of life do I want to live? I took a deep breath, feeling the night air against my skin. Then I pulled out my phone. I had one last thing to do. One final loose end to tie up. The next day I went to visit my father. The prison smelled of iron and sweat, a place where powerful men lost everything. I sat across from him, separated by a thick glass wall. He looked at me with hollow eyes, the fire inside him completely extinguished. He picked up the phone, his hand trembling. "Why are you here?" I leaned in, voice steady. "To say goodbye." His jaw clenched, but he said nothing. For the first time in his life, he had no more control. No power.
No escape.
And that was better than any revenge I could have ever imagined. I smiled softly. "Enjoy your new life, Dad." Then I hung up the phone, stood and walked away. I never turned back. I stood on a rooftop, looking down at the city below me. The world felt bigger now. Because I wasn't the same girl I had been before. I had been a victim. Then I became a warrior. And now I was free. For the first time, my future was truly mine. Not dictated by my family. Not trapped in the past. Just mine. I smiled, closing my eyes. Because for the first time in 2 lifetimes, I could finally live.